Hi, my name's David Gilson, and I'm Managing Director at College and County. We thought we'd put together a short webinar about the Renters' Rights Bill. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it and started to see the news articles that are talking about the impacts it's going to have. And we thought it would be helpful to put together something just to give a bit of ideas from our perspective of how we can see some of these changes to our legislation and we work around being implemented, and hopefully provide some reassurance in certain areas, because I think we're fortunate to work in the markets we do. And I think sometimes the impacts are not going to be as great as the papers might be making out. I've brought along some experts from my team. I've got Chris, Head of Property Management, and Sonali, the Assistant Head of Property Management, to hopefully guide us through this. No one's in reality an expert. No one has all the answers with this stuff. So a lot of it is interpretation until it's all written down and finalised. It's kind of best guess in terms of working out how it's going to be implemented and how it's going to be seen. But I think there's value in being aware of it, because we can start thinking about what we're going to do to adjust the land.
Yeah, and at the moment it's in committee stage as of the 22nd of October. We're expecting to have another possible reading before Christmas, and there's obviously going to be some changes that have been presented to it as well. But in its current format, we are looking towards implementation towards
summer of 2025, yeah. And one of the key things that's being most discussed about is the abolishing of the Section 21s and also the removal of the no-fault eviction. So that is one of the most discussed points across the board with regards to how it's going to pan out for everyone involved.
It's probably a good place to start.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of chat about Section 21, as Sonali says. The reality is, for most of the clients watching this right now today, you've probably never served Section 21 under no fault. The reality is that Section 21 is used a lot, mainly for reasons that would normally fall now under Section 8. So we have two ways of bringing a tenancy to an end. We have Section 21 currently, and we have Section 8. Section 21 is no fault, so it essentially means that you don't need reason. It brings the tenancy to an end without any reason needing to be given. Section 8, you have to give reason before. So it could be rent arrears previously. It could be that the tenant was, breach of contract, or there was antisocial behaviour. Any of those reasons were previously covered under Section 8. But landlords all still use Section 21 because it was a guaranteed end to the tenancy, whereas Section 8 could be interpreted by the court differently or could be pushed back. The way it's going to be going forwards, and I think the reality is that this is the new reality that we're all going to have to adjust to, is that we will essentially be using Section 8 for all ways to bring a tenancy to an end. It does mean that a landlord who just gets annoyed with their tenant, if that tenant is paying their rent, looking after the property, and there is no reason to bring the tenancy to an end other than the fact that the landlord doesn't like that tenant, they won't be able to. That is the reality, but it's super, super rare that we have those situations. And I think that's part of the reason landlords use agents like us. Our job is to find tenants and to sometimes shelter you from the tricky moments, but also find tenants that we completely trust, believe in. And I think that's what my team are really good at doing. And I think that's where we can show real value to our clients, in the fact that we'll find you nice tenants who you don't have to worry about from that perspective. If you do want to sell the property, if you do want to move back in there, if your tenant does get into significant arrears, or any of the other reasons mentioned before in terms of antisocial behaviour, etc., you will still be able to bring that tenancy to an end. The way it's currently written in terms of the white paper and the legislation that's being discussed in the Commons is that tenants, instead of having, as it stands at the moment, a tenant under an assured shorthold has a minimum of 6 months right of that property. The legislation changes that to 12 months. So every tenancy that we put in place, the tenant has a right to a minimum of 12 months before a landlord can serve notice. But the landlord can then give 4 months notice under any of those reasons to bring that tenancy to an end. It's not completely clear whether or not that's 4 months after 12 or before 12, but most people think that essentially at the 8-month point, you'd be able to give notice to bring the tenancy to an end at a 12-month point, as it's being discussed at the moment. So for most landlords, I genuinely do not think removal of Section 21 will have a big impact. It does lead on to, as well as that, the introduction of periodic tenancies. So rather than, as it stands at the moment, every tenancy being a fixed period, it will instead be that every tenancy starts with an indefinite end date. So whenever your tenant moves in, rather than it being a 12-month term or allowing us to manage that tenancy into a specific cycle, we will instead be open-ended with every contract starting. We're still allowed to review the rent. So, every 12 months we can have a rent review and kind of make sure that the rent's not falling behind market value. But we won't have a fixed end date.
I guess that's got big ramifications for our student portfolio.
Yeah, I think the reality is that for most professional landlords, again, in Tame area, in Oxford area, the reality is that the loss of fixed term contracts won't matter. If you're working the professional cycle, since COVID, the market, particularly in Oxford, has become much less seasonal. So for student properties, obviously different to this, but for the vast majority of the properties we look after, it's much, much less important that they come up in a certain time of year, because what happened during COVID was a lot of agents allowed their tenancies to go periodic. So a lot of tenants were moving at random times of year, rather than historically, we've always in Oxford aligned everything with the summer. So I think we've already started to see that change. And I think all that's going to happen is that's going to be amplified by the fact that tenants can decide when they want to go. Because as well as landlords being required to give tenants a certain period of notice to end it for those reasons, tenants do have the right from the start of their tenancy to give 2 months notice to bring the tenancy to an end. It sounds scary, that idea that a tenant can move in and then give notice straight away. But I think. But
it will even out the demand. From the perspective, just the fact that there will be tenants who look to move out at certain different periods of the year. We will also then have demand for properties across various periods of the year.
And also, I think the key point is that comes down to our checking. It's more important than ever to make sure we're really careful when we bring the property. The normal tenants that we let to, we've checked where they're working. We've checked why they're moving. The reality is that it's super unlikely that someone's going to be able to just want a short let in Oxford and mess us around by taking a property on and serving notice, because they'd have had to have got a job. They'd have had to, we'd have done so many checks on them that it just really wouldn't make sense. And the idea that someone would move in and then decide actually they want to move out, you have to understand that moving house I think for most people, it's a real job.
Yeah.
And if you commit to moving, I think it will take an awful lot for someone to decide that they want to leave. And so, paying another deposit, so they're not going to get their deposit back until they've been checked out. Yes. They'd have to obviously organise removals after 2 months of being there. So I think it's probably not going to, in itself, I don't think that will change things. I think personally that tenancies will be longer. I think the average tenants will stay longer in the professional, lets, because they won't have an end date. Whereas at the moment they have a date to work towards, and they go, after I'm here for a year and then I'll see what I'm going to do. The reality is they'll be entering into it without an end date. And so time will pass and they'll end up staying, I'm sure, average tenancy wise. And that's what we've seen in Wales. So they've already had a similar bit of legislation been put in place, and average tenancies have increased because of it. So I think the professional landlords in Tame and Oxfordshire as a whole, I really don't think that it's going to be of any real concern losing that fixed term contract. And we'll make sure that on an annual basis, we'll still contact you, we'll review the rent, make sure the rents aren't falling behind, so that we can kind of keep the tenancy working. I think the one area that obviously is of more concern, and is something that is being discussed in the committee stage quite heavily, is the impact on student landlords, because students inevitably are very seasonal. The student properties have to be let within a certain window of time, which is over the course of the summer months. And they have brought in a new ground, they're introducing a new ground for possession, which is that you can serve notice on a student property. So we can fix an end date for student groups. I suppose the oversight on that is that although we can fix an end date, we can't control when the tenant wants to leave. So although we can say, yeah, that tenancy is going to end on the 1st of August, the reality is that group in there could decide that actually they all want to give notice in May and all leave on the 1st of July. So I think that's the one thing which we have to work out a way around. But again, I feel like it's something whereby our relationship with tenants can really help.
Yeah, and I think if we're going to, certainly as it goes to the final stages, work out exactly where we position ourselves with tenants in contacting them about when they want to end the tenancies. Now, whether we do that, we do it reasonably early on anyway, but as soon as they've moved in, we're working out what position they're going to be in, what's their plans for the next summer, and working out what the landlords, because if you've got a really good property, it's going to be able to let, and we'll be able to work out in terms of the kind of the periods between tenancies and what works can be done to make sure that the next step is even better and the tenants want to stay even longer. So it just puts us back in that position.
Well, we're in the process of doing our student list release at the moment for November, December time. And we've had 30 groups find friends wanting their houses. which I kind of shows the way that we work as a whole, is the relationships we have with our students. Is that I genuinely believe, if this comes in the way it's currently written, is that if currently in October we contact all the student groups and we ask them if they'd like to renew, if as well as doing that we said, look, are you thinking of staying for a second academic year, or are you going to be giving notice? If you can confirm that notice and confirm when you'd like to leave by, we'll incentivise it. Nothing massive, but I think that with the relationship we have and the property managers have with their student groups, if we sat down with them and said, look, there's £100 delivery voucher in it for you, if you could confirm and give notice for the date you wish to leave by, I expect we'd be able to work much more efficiently, knowing that chances are they'll leave on that date. And rather than us just picking a date to serve notice to, they've confirmed that that's probably the date they want to go on. They won't be able to stay beyond that date. There is the risk that they decide actually they want to leave earlier than that. But I think for 99.9% of groups, once they've confirmed that and been incentivized to give that date, they'll stick to it, because again, they'll feel like that's the end date of their contract. So I think that there's workarounds for it. I don't think it's as disastrous as I think the market has been portrayed. We look after a lot of undergraduate student property. We also look after a lot of professional and postgraduate student property. I think the market for postgraduate and professional student property will be less seasonal. I think the reality is that for professional HMO lets, and it seems like an obvious route to go down to move from undergraduate into professional and postgraduate, but the reality is that there's more chance they'll want to leave out of summer completely. So whereas undergraduate student lettings are much more likely to stay into a summer to summer cycle, if you're letting to a group of professionals, they could decide they want to leave in January, they could decide they want to leave in March, and you have to adjust to it at that point. So there's swings and roundabouts to which way to go. But I think the reality is all of this stuff will put further demand on a really shrinking supply of good quality accommodation for students and professionals and sharers. And so I think that we will probably see rents going up. Demand will mean that we can let most types of property at any time of year. And I don't think there's anything in the legislation that's going to help improve it for renters in terms of the ability to get hold of houses. The ideas that have been put forward as this is going to help renters. I think the reality is this is going to put further demand and pressures on a limited amount of stock, because inevitably it will result in some landlords deciding that time's up and they'll want to get out of the market. But I honestly do believe that the market will find its way, and that for the vast majority of landlords, they'll not see a real dip in terms of the income they can expect from their property and the way their business works. Yeah. We've gone through various legislative changes over the years. This is probably one of the biggest, but I don't in any way, shape or form see it as making the market unviable. I think there's definite opportunity there still.
Yeah. So as we understand more in terms of what is actually coming into the written bill, I think the challenge for us is in terms of taking the actions for the key concerns, which is extra long void periods or loss of rent from the perspective of our landlords. And if we take preemptive actions, or if we have a plan in place, then we just through our actions want to assure our clients, and also our tenants for that matter, that it doesn't need to be all doom and gloom.
We also seen the reality is that even without, and this is part of the reason why the pressures on student stock are going to get greater and greater, is that the average rents for family homes in the city have gone up and up and up much faster than student property rents have gone up. And so we've seen landlords move student property into family lets to avoid needing to bother with HMO regulation and the slightly lighter selective licensing legislation they have in Oxford. And so I think that's kind of another reason why that shrinking housing stock will be there, because and all that's going to do is drive further pressure on that on a demand on what stock there is left. There is still questions to be answered, and this is one of the key points being discussed in the committee stage, that there is an argument from NRLA and also Property Mark put forward that whereby a fixed term contract is in the interests of both parties, that it should still be allowed. I'm not sure in reality if that will actually come to anything. I think it would resolve this issue if it did, because it would allow us to still work on a fixed term contract for these sort of tenancies. I think that my expectation is that we'll probably have to just work with the legislation, roughly speaking, as it is at the moment. But I really do see a way through that for student landlords. And I see an ever increasing market. I think, as I said, I think it's positive in a way. We can find that way through.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next part of the legislation, which is about property standards and landlords' obligations, which includes things like the new ombudsman and tenancy portals and the standards of properties.
Yeah. And I mean, it also obviously,
one of the key things that we've seen, not just recently, but from the cost of living crisis, is the concerns with regards to mold and condensation in the property. And it is one of the, with the Awaab's law being introduced as part of the bill or coming into action, it is one of the things that is of concern. Making sure that the property is habitable and mold free. The landlord particularly has an obligation towards showing that they are carrying out whatever's reasonable from the perspective of ensuring that, and it is one of the points, along with pets and along with other areas of living in the property.
I think as Chris touched on before, we look after, in the most part, properties for really good landlords who are conscientious, who look after their properties and present them well. Obviously in Oxford we have selective and additional and HMO licensing, so the vast majority of properties looked after by Oxford are already licensed and already kind of part of a check by the council anyway. The idea of bringing in an additional portal for all landlords to be part of, I don't think should be of any concern to our clients in any way, shape or form. This will be there to try and catch out landlords who aren't who aren't following legislation, who aren't making sure we have compliance certificates in place. And I think that, again, part of the benefit of working with an agency like us is the fact that we make sure your properties are compliant. We're making sure that, when your gas safety needs reviewing, we can get someone around to do it. As Sonali says, I think increasingly mold has been something that has cropped up. I think cost of living crisis did make a difference because inevitably heating and keeping windows open was probably slightly harder because people were worried about the potential costs that they were going to be incurring from their utility bills. So I think it's something we, as agents and as landlords, we have to be aware of and have to respond to. If it's reported, we have to take it seriously and we have to react to it. But the reality is that we deal with this all the time, and the vast majority of situations whereby we have reports of mold in a property, that we have some great documentation that we provide to tenants and advice we can give them, and normally it's easily resolved with a bit of communication, a bit of guidance from the team. And again, that's what we're here for, to protect you from those sorts of situations. I think pets are going to be more common in rental properties. There's no two ways about it. We'll have to give good reason why a pet is not suitable for that property. There are properties whereby I know landlords would have preferred not to have a pet in, that will now be tricky to think of a good enough reason why we can say no in that situation. Certainly, though, properties that aren't suitable for pets still won't have pets in them. If you've got a flat on the first floor that has communal entrances, or you've got a flat with no garden or anything like that, whereby it's not got the space to have a pet in, or that there's areas whereby it's going to be shared by other people who don't necessarily want a pet, there'll still be valid reasons you can give where it's not suitable and you can tell people they can't.
And as part of what we do as a property management team, we'll be regularly checking the properties. So if there is a pet in the property, we'll be making sure that as part of our regular visits, that it's not causing any damage above wear and tear to the property. And it's one of the things, the obligations we can make sure that tenants do, is take out pet insurance to cover themselves over any damage that the pet may cause. So we'll be doing everything from our point of view to make sure during a tenancy that there's no damage that's being caused, and we can have those conversations very early on with tenants throughout the duration of tenancy, so it's not left until the end and we're dealing with a deposit. So it's just about being proactive to having pets in the property, and like David said, making sure the properties are the right ones for those. And with the shortage of stock in Oxford, that we've got to make sure we get the right tenant, and if that does involve a pet, then we have to make sure we kind of making sure the liability is on the tenant on that side of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the other part of it is minimum energy efficiency standards. So it's now been retabled that it's 2030 now is the minimum band C grading for an EPC on a rental property. I'll believe it when I see it. I think there's definite work that needs to happen on the legislation and on the template for EPCs before the reality of the 2030 deadline is going to be anything to worry about. I can see that's a long time away in reality, in real terms, and I personally can see a complete review of that structure before we're actually having something to actually work towards. So I wouldn't necessarily act on your current EPC. I would wait and see.
Yeah, because our conversations with the companies that carry out EPC evaluations have resulted in quite a few holes in how the structure is currently. It doesn't accommodate things like solar panel energy efficiency or heat source pumps or things like that, which are what will be the more energy efficient actions. But till the time that can be incorporated into a system that reflects it correctly for the EPC ratings, your regular actions such as loft insulations or energy efficient bulbs and what our landlords have already been taking, it will be absolutely fine for the moment till we know more in terms of the whole system as well.
Yeah, I think when there's clarity on that, we'll keep you informed. Obviously, it's a fair distance away, and I wouldn't say any kind of shock changes are sensible, but as Sonali says, the simple things can make a big difference, and then we'll see where the template goes and if EPC is what we're working towards or if there's a different bit of compliance certification that comes in to replace it. And the other thing, I mean, discrimination as well, is obviously it's worth touching on. We don't work with clients who discriminate anyway. The reality is that this is to avoid situations whereby there's been terrible practice from landlords and agents listing properties not suitable for single mums and things like that. The reality is that we're there to find the best tenant for the property. We don't discriminate, and certainly families, we let to an awful lot of families. It comes down to that point, if the property is suitable, it's still not going to be a case of any property can be taken by anyone. It's still finding a property that is suitable for that individual that's applying and affordable at that stage as well. So I don't think that's going to, again, have any real impact on the way that your business is run.
So a lot of conversations with landlords are coming up with these queries in terms of what kind of escalation points will be available for them. Everything seems to be quite, obviously more tenant orientated, and landlords feel like whether they're getting the shorter end of the stick and whether they'll have recourse to resolution. But there are plans as part of the bill where not just the Section 8 availability, but also having an escalation point through the ombudsman.
Yeah, so the proposal is that there'll be a new ombudsman who would be there to try and avoid certain situations needing to go to court. Until it's clear in terms of how that's going to work, it's difficult to know exactly how useful that would be. But essentially, the idea is that where there's dispute between landlord and tenant, rather than everything resulting in a notice to go to court, there could be this third party who would then essentially help arbitrate and have the power to do that. I think it comes down to that power. Essentially, do they have the power to call it, to tell the tenant to pay up or get out, or is it the reality is that they'll be settling more minor disputes between tenant and landlord? We'll see. At the moment, it's impossible to know what that's going to be, but it could be great. If there is this third party ombudsman who's willing to arbitrate situations to allow us to get to a point whereby we bring the tenancies to a close if they need to quicker. Brilliant, because the last thing anyone wants is to get caught up in the court system.
It's got to be a demonstration so far that the ombudsman can take on the volume that the court would deal with. So that's where a position we'll see. We're hopeful that there's something that was both landlord and tenant ability to go and raise those queries rather than having to go through courts, because there's very few times we've had to do that. It's time consuming, and hopefully the ombudsman gives us an option for smaller disputes to be settled.
Or actionable resolution. Yeah. So, it's not just a point of arbitration, but actual resolution through the ombudsman.
Yeah. I mean, I genuinely do think the key to all of this, unfortunately, we have been working this way for an awful long time, is it's all about tenant making sure you've got the right tenant in the property. I think more so than ever, making sure the tenant is the right tenant in the property is going to be key. And I think that's what, fortunately, my team are really good at. We'll continue to make sure that we get the right tenants, because if you've got the right tenant, all of this kind of just becomes noise. The reality is that for the vast majority of landlords, this will not make any big impact at all to your businesses. Yes, there's questions that need to be answered for student landlords to work out how we will still allow ourselves to work as far ahead of as we do at the moment. For those of you that don't get involved with that market, we let the student property 9-10 months ahead of availability often. And it's not clear how that would be possible, and it may not be possible under this legislation. But I don't think that's to say that that's going to stop us being able to let student property. It's just that we'll adapt to it, and there will be a change that has to take place in terms of our processes and the way that we work. But I think for the vast majority of landlords, they will see longer term tenants, because tenants will not have an end date to their contracts. We will still be able to review the rents on an annual basis to make sure your rents don't fall behind. You will still be able to get your property back if you wish to sell it, or if you wish to move in there yourself, or if the tenant is in serious breach of the contract or falls into arrears. And I think that's the kind of key takeaway, I would say, really, from my perspective, is that there is an awful lot that's discussed around this that is clickbait. It's there to try and get people riled up and to get people, feeling one way or the other in terms of their opinion. I think the reality is that this will not have as big an impact on the sector as people think it will. I think the market will find its way. And I think that I'm fortunate to say that we've got a team in place to make it as smooth as possible and to adapt to that legislative change as and when it needs to happen. So for all of you that are watching this as managed clients, I genuinely think that we can take off the stress from you. There will be requirements potentially at some point for you to join this landlord database. When that time comes, we'll give you the advice and tell you what you need to do. If there's a way that we can do it on your behalf, we'll certainly do that for you, or advice on what we can do for you at that stage. There is a lot of this still needs clarity in terms of when it goes through the various steps it's going to go through. So the feedback from the committee stage, when that's heard, when it goes on to the third reading and then moves on to the House of Lords, we'll get clarity on exactly how these parts are going to be implemented. And a big part of it is going to be the court reform, which is going to have to come on the back of this, because dealing with an awful lot of Section 8 notices with reason rather than Section 21 without reason is going to use more court time. And so there's going to be more demand on those notices when the time does come. But as I say, we'll keep you posted.
Yeah.
And the team are keeping kind of ahead of the game. So whenever there's new information out, we'll listen about it. And if there's anything that comes out which fundamentally changes our stance on this situation, we of course will do a further report to you and give you further opinion on kind of what we feel you need to be doing at that stage. But as for now, I mean, I think more than anything, in Oxford and Tame, we work in markets whereby we have a surplus of really great quality tenants who, are, in the most part, we've got great tenants. Fortunately, we work with great landlords, but on the flip side of that, because we work with great landlords, we're able to attract really good quality tenants who look after the property as well, who, are happy to be accommodating when they can be. And I think all of this stuff will really help us find our way through the market. Whereas some landlords might decide it's too tricky and they can't work it, but it's probably because of lack of planning at that point, because I'm confident that that's not going to be the case for our clients. So feel free to reach out if you've got any questions or anything that you feel like we should be answering. Well, I think we're going to put together a little survey as well to be sent out along with this video. So take the time to just hopefully be a few minutes of your time to put into that. But to get a bit of feedback, we'll also some guidance from you as far as what you'd like to hear us talking about that's going to bring value, because we're there to help. So if there's topics you feel like it'll be helpful for us to discuss, we're happy to put the time in to put something together for you to give you that resource.
Yeah. We hope this is a good start. And if you've got further questions, we are always happy to be here for answering those. For the moment, from Chris, David, and myself, that's the end of this session. Thank you for joining. Bye.